At 6:47 p.m. on a drizzly Wednesday evening, October 22nd, 1980, inside a quiet public library tucked between a hardware store and a dentist's office on the outskirts of Cedar Junction, Ohio, a 52-year-old librarian named Harold Benton walked toward the back shelves with a stack of returned books in his arms, unaware that a thin envelope hidden inside one of them would trigger a counterintelligence investigation that would eventually dismantle one of the most discreet Soviet dead-drop networks ever discovered on American soil. The fluorescent lights flickered softly above him, humming in that familiar, tired rhythm common to small-town libraries built in the 1960s. The carpet beneath his shoes was slightly damp from the umbrellas shaken near the entrance. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady whisper, tapping lightly against the wide rectangular windows that looked out over the empty parking lot. Harold moved with the same calm, methodical gestures he had practiced for more than 20 years, straightening returned books, aligning spines, sliding volumes back into their places one by one. It was a routine moment in an ordinary day, and no one observing him would have suspected that one of the most quietly damaging espionage operations of the late Cold War was already unfolding in the narrow aisles behind him. This is the story of a small-town librarian who spent most of his life surrounded by novels, encyclopedias, and the soft scent of old paper, and yet became a vital courier in a clandestine system built by the KGB to smuggle classified documents out of the United States. It is the story of how an unremarkable man, known to neighbors as polite and slightly withdrawn, was drawn into espionage through a mixture of ideology, loneliness, and the illusion that small acts carried no real consequence. It is the story of a dead-drop network hidden in the simplest of places, between library shelves, inside book covers, behind the false back of a filing drawer, operated quietly for years while the FBI circled closer without realizing its true scale. It is also a story of betrayal, of how a single mistake in a routine workday unraveled a chain of secrets that stretched from Ohio to Moscow. And it is a reminder of the quiet, devastating cost that the Cold War inflicted on ordinary families who had no idea they were living beside someone engaged in a private conflict fought in the shadows. In those weeks before anyone understood what they were looking at, the Cedar Junction Public Library felt like any other small American library during the early 1980s. Students came in after school to finish homework or flip through magazines. Retired men browsed newspapers near the front window, commenting quietly about local politics. A teenage boy sometimes fell asleep in the beanbag chair near the community bulletin board. Harold knew almost all of them by name. His routines were predictable. He arrived just before 8 a.m., checked the overnight book returns, turned on the microfilm machine, recorded the new magazine issues, and spent most of the day shelving, sorting, and helping patrons locate titles. To the outside world, nothing could have seemed more mundane. Yet according to declassified FBI files, the first hints of irregular activity in Cedar Junction surfaced as early as February 1979, months before anyone noticed the pattern. At that time, a field office in Columbus had been investigating a series of coded letters mailed from obscure towns across Ohio to an address in New York, later identified as a KGB-operated mail drop. Most letters contained meaningless content: travel brochures, photocopies of public schedules, handwritten notes that looked like ordinary correspondence. but a subset contained subtle markings, small dots placed above specific letters, slight indentations made by a soft pencil, unusual spacing patterns resembling book cipher coordinates. Analysts were unable to decipher them, but one observation stood out. Several letters referenced book titles that matched items in the Cedar Junction Library's catalog. Still, nothing pointed directly to Harold. He was not a traveler, had no political affiliations, and had never attracted the slightest suspicion from local authorities. But behind his calm demeanor, his life was narrower and more fragile than it appeared. He had been widowed 7 years earlier after his wife died of a sudden stroke. His only daughter lived in Michigan and rarely visited. His friends consisted mostly of other library staff and a few older patrons who exchanged brief conversations about gardening or weather. And according to the later psychological assessment filed after his arrest, he carried a persistent sense of invisibility, a belief that he moved through life without leaving any meaningful trace. Such sentiments, while not uncommon among aging Midwesterners living alone, made him susceptible to the kind of subtle recruitment methods that Soviet intelligence occasionally employed: friendly conversation, shared literature, ideological nods disguised as intellectual debate. The turning point came on a quiet afternoon in March 1979, when an unfamiliar patron began visiting the library every Friday around 3 p.m. The man signed the guest log as Arthur Fleming, though the FBI later confirmed he was a KGB officer operating under deep cover. He wore neutral jackets, avoided extended interactions, and spent most of his time browsing foreign policy journals or older history books. Harold noticed him only because the man always returned books in pristine condition, never leaving so much as a folded corner. Over several weeks, Fleming initiated small talk about authors, particularly Russian literature. He asked Harold whether the library carried certain editions of Chekhov or Gorky, mentioned he was originally from the East Coast, said he worked in import logistics, a vague phrase often used by Soviet illegal officers. Harold found the conversation refreshing in a small-town environment where few people discussed international affairs. He did not know that these interactions were early steps in a recruitment script. According to testimony obtained years later, Fleming offered Harold a rare Soviet history book, claiming he had borrowed it from a friend. Inside, tucked between pages 142 and 143, was a small card with a sequence of numbers and a simple instruction: for exchange, shelf D24. Harold claimed during interrogation that he believed it was part of a literary game, something akin to a scavenger hunt. When he placed the book on the assigned shelf, he discovered a second volume with a different numerical code. The pattern repeated for weeks, slowly shifting from harmless intellectual puzzles to instructions involving small sealed envelopes left inside hollowed-out books. Fleming explained it as a hobby, an anonymous book exchange network involving collectors who enjoyed secrecy for its own sake. Harold, who had grown accustomed to the routines of quiet library life, found it intriguing and harmless. But the envelopes contained microfilm, and the microfilm contained classified corporate data stolen from defense contractors in Ohio and Michigan. Unknown to Harold, he had already become part of a courier chain designed to move sensitive material from local sources to KGB handlers on the East Coast. His role was simple: collect a book from a specific shelf, remove the envelope concealed inside, and replace it with another delivered by a later visitor. The library served perfectly for such exchanges, quiet, predictable, and filled with inconspicuous hiding places. The KGB had used similar methods in other towns: post offices, laundromats, university libraries, even church basements. Cedar Junction was ideal precisely because it appeared insignificant. Through the following year, Harold's behavior began shifting in subtle ways that no one around him noticed. He stayed later after closing, sometimes reorganizing shelves unnecessarily. He grew more protective of certain book carts, moving them himself, rather than allowing junior staff to assist. He occasionally locked the archive room during his breaks, something he had never done before. These changes seemed minor, the kind of habits that might develop in any dedicated librarian. Yet according to FBI reconstruction, this period saw a steady increase in dead drop exchanges, at least 40 documented swaps between April 1979 and October 1980. By late 1980, the KGB operation gained momentum. The microfilm began to include more sensitive items: photographs of the interior of manufacturing facilities, snippets of contractor communications, early-stage technical diagrams. And while Harold claimed he never looked inside the envelopes, forensic analysis later suggested he handled the material long enough to understand it was not simply part of a book collector's game. But he kept going, driven by a mixture of habit and the quiet thrill of participating in something that felt larger than himself. The critical mistake occurred on the night of October 22nd, 1980, the night the rain tapped softly against the library windows, and Harold discovered the envelope tucked inside a returned book titled Midwestern Railroads, a Historical Survey. As he placed the book on the sorting table, the thin white envelope slid slightly from the pages, exposing a black strip of microfilm. According to his later statement, he panicked briefly, unsure whether anyone nearby had seen it. In his haste, he pushed the envelope back into the book, but aligned it incorrectly. Instead of settling flush against the spine, the corner protruded slightly from the edge. He placed the book on the D24 shelf, intending to return to it later. But the misplaced envelope became the anomaly that would eventually expose the network. The next morning, a high school student named Lewis Grant checked out the book as part of an assignment on transportation history. He noticed the envelope immediately and turned it over to the assistant librarian, who in turn handed it to Harold. In theory, he could have removed the envelope quietly and redirected the situation, but something about the boy's lingering curiosity unsettled him. The incident broke the predictability he had depended on for more than a year. And according to FBI files, this was the first moment Harold considered abandoning the entire operation. But by then, he was already too deeply embedded. That same afternoon, the assistant librarian logged the incident in the internal notes file, recording that a patron had discovered a misplaced envelope inside a returned book. The note was routine. Staff often documented strange occurrences, but a month earlier, the library had received a memo from the county office requesting staff to report anything unusual involving library materials due to a string of minor thefts in nearby towns. As a result, the memo copy was forwarded automatically to the county administrative office, where a clerk noticed the phrasing and flagged it for review. 3 days later, on October 25th, an FBI field agent named Daniel Harker visited the library posing as a patron. He browsed the shelves quietly, paying close attention to the D24 section. He checked out 2 books, returned them minutes later, then walked through the aisles observing staff routines. According to his later report, Harold appeared nervous, glancing repeatedly at the shelves as if guarding something. That observation, combined with the earlier flagged memo, led Harker to initiate a preliminary inquiry. What followed would eventually be known inside the FBI as the beginning of Operation Quiet Harvest, a counterintelligence effort focused on identifying and dismantling a Soviet dead drop system hidden within the Cedar Junction Library. Operation Quiet Harvest did not begin with dramatic arrests or late-night surveillance vans. It started quietly, just a single field report sent from one desk to another inside the Columbus field office on October 27, 1980. The memo described the unusual envelope found inside a book, the librarian's nervous behavior, and the presence of a man who had visited the library regularly, but whose background had not yet been identified. Most such memos led nowhere. The Cold War had generated thousands of false alarms in small towns across America. But the phrasing of this particular report caught the attention of Supervisory Special Agent Karen Delaney, who had spent the previous year analyzing irregularities in the coded letters mailed to New York. Several of those letters referenced books whose catalog numbers matched Cedar Junction's system. Delaney requested quiet observation rather than an official investigation. The difference was subtle but important. Quiet observation meant no paperwork, no notification to headquarters, no disruption of routines. It was a method used when agents suspected something unusual but lacked enough evidence to justify a full case. In early November, 2 FBI surveillance specialists, posing as traveling salesmen, began visiting the library at irregular intervals. They sat near the reading room windows, browsing newspapers while discreetly noting the movements of staff and regular patrons. They tracked which shelves attracted unusual attention, how often certain books shifted positions, and whether any individuals exhibited repetitive behaviors consistent with dead drop operations. It took less than a week for them to notice Harold's patterns, his tendency to return to the same shelf multiple times a day, his habit of lingering near the archive room door, and the way he occasionally shielded book carts from the view of other staff. One observer reported that Harold frequently handled older history books, even when no patron had returned them recently. Another noted that Harold sometimes carried a small handwritten notebook that he tucked into his jacket pocket at the slightest sign someone might be approaching. The FBI could not yet identify the significance of these details, but their accumulation suggested an underlying structure, something more deliberate than the absent-minded habits of an aging librarian. Meanwhile, the KGB handler known as Arthur Fleming continued visiting every Friday, always around 3 p.m., always browsing the same sections. Surveillance agents observed that he rarely checked out books despite spending long periods in the library. They also noted that he sometimes traced his finger along the edges of certain shelves, as though searching for something hidden. But without a clear link to Harold, the FBI remained cautious. They had seen similar patterns in false alarms involving local eccentrics or hobbyists embroiled in secretive but harmless games. They needed more. That evidence arrived unexpectedly on November 14th, when another envelope appeared. This time inside a different book in a different section of the library. The envelope contained microfilm as before, But the most significant detail was the handwriting on the corner of the paper. It matched handwriting found in at least 3 letters sent to the KGB mail drop in New York. The FBI had their first concrete connection. Through the following weeks, Operation Quiet Harvest expanded. Agents placed a small recording device behind the D-24 shelf, capturing the faint rustle of pages and the soft thud of books being moved. They installed a camera inside a ceiling vent, angled toward the aisle. The equipment was rudimentary by modern standards, the image grainy and the audio muffled, but it provided enough evidence to confirm that Harold was retrieving items left by an unknown visitor. The recordings revealed a pattern. At least once every 2 weeks, a book appeared with subtle signs of tampering. The spine would be slightly misaligned, the pages smoothed too uniformly, or a thin crease would appear along the inner margin. Within hours, often minutes, Harold would collect the book, remove something from inside it using the cover of routine shelving, and replace the book with another volume prepared earlier. The process was smooth, efficient, and executed with the practiced calm of someone who believed he was invisible. To those around him, Harold seemed unchanged. He still greeted regular patrons by name, still volunteered at community events, still recommended novels to teenagers who wandered into the library with nowhere else to be on weekday afternoons. But surveillance footage, though silent and grainy, told a different story. It showed moments when Harold paused mid-step, glancing over his shoulder with the weary caution of someone who expected footsteps behind him. It showed him checking his watch repeatedly on days when Fleming visited. It showed him wiping his palms on his trousers before handling certain envelopes. Small gestures, but each one hinted at the internal tension he carefully hid from those who believed they knew him. According to later testimony, Harold had begun losing sleep. Neighbors would later recall seeing him outside on his porch at odd hours, staring toward the street as though waiting for someone. The FBI, unaware of this side of his life, interpreted his behavior solely through the lens of espionage. They noted that he had begun locking the archive room, even when stepping away for a moment. They observed that he occasionally took short drives before work, deviating from his usual routine. From their perspective, these were indicators of operational tradecraft, checking for surveillance, identifying potential threats, adjusting patterns to avoid detection. The truth was simpler, but no less significant. Harold had begun to fear the weight of what he was doing. On December 2nd, the FBI intercepted a coded letter mailed from a small post office in Dayton. The letter referenced 2 book titles known to be part of the library's collection. Analysts decoded the numerical patterns into a set of instructions. Transfer on 12th December, location B19, confirm sequence. The date matched a Friday. Fleming's usual visit time matched the expected schedule. The FBI realized they were witnessing an active transfer and decided it was time to escalate. Operation Quiet Harvest shifted from observation to intervention. Agents prepared a controlled surveillance plan. They coordinated with the library director, who agreed to keep staff presence minimal on the designated day. They deployed 3 undercover agents disguised as patrons, 2 stationed near the front entrance, 1 near the reading area. Another pair monitored the parking lot from a sedan disguised as a delivery vehicle. The objective was not to arrest anyone immediately, but to gather enough evidence to justify a full counterintelligence case. On December 12th, At 2:58 p.m., Fleming entered the library, carrying a brown leather bag. Surveillance footage shows him walking calmly toward the B19 shelf, removing a book, flipping through it casually, and returning it to the shelf. At 3:12 p.m., Harold approached the same aisle, glancing briefly around before retrieving the book. He opened it under the pretense of checking for damage, removed a thin envelope, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his sweater vest. He then replaced the book with one he had carried in on a cart. The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. For the FBI, this was the confirmation they needed. They now had verifiable evidence of a dead drop transfer, but they did not yet know the scope of the network or how many individuals were involved. They chose not to arrest Harold or Fleming that day. Instead, they followed them. Agents trailing Fleming observed him leaving the library, driving to a grocery store on the outskirts of town, entering briefly without purchasing anything, then continuing to a motel where he met an unidentified man. The meeting, though brief, suggested Fleming was not working alone. Agents trailing Harold watched him drive home on quiet residential streets. He behaved normally, parked in his driveway, retrieved his mail, entered his house. But just after sunset, he re-emerged carrying a folded paper bag. He placed the bag in the trunk of his car and drove toward the edge of town. Surveillance logs indicate he drove past several potential drop sites, alleys, public parks, small bridges, before stopping near an abandoned grain silo. He exited the car, walked behind a cluster of bushes, and returned empty-handed. Agents located the bag minutes later. Inside was microfilm. They replaced it with blank film and restored the bag to its original position, allowing the KGB retrieval chain to continue uninterrupted. Over the next 4 weeks, the FBI documented 4 more exchanges. Each one provided deeper insights into how the network functioned. The library was the initial exchange point between a local source and a courier. Harold transferred the material to an outdoor dead drop. A secondary courier retrieved the package and delivered it to a regional handler. That handler forwarded it through a multi-state chain of intermediaries until it reached New York, where a final courier sent it to Moscow through diplomatic channels. Arrests at this stage would have disrupted the chain, but revealed little about its structure. The FBI wanted the entire network, not just one librarian. As winter settled over Cedar Junction, Harold's mental state deteriorated. Co-workers noticed his hands trembling as he sorted books. He occasionally misfiled items, something he had not done in years. At home, he avoided Christmas gatherings and spent long hours staring at an old photograph of his late wife. Somewhere in the quiet routines of his isolated life, the excitement of participating in something clandestine had given way to a dull, persistent dread. The FBI observed all of this without knowing the full context. Agents described Harold as methodical, cautious, increasingly tense, but they did not see the human collapse unfolding behind closed doors. They saw only the behavior of a man who appeared deeply committed to his operational role. Everything accelerated in January 1981. On January 5th, the FBI intercepted a new coded letter that included a phrase analysts interpreted as a warning. Risk elevated. New channels required. Whether this referred to increased surveillance or a new directive from Moscow was unclear, but it signaled that the KGB suspected something. Fearing the operation might collapse before they gathered enough evidence, The FBI executed the next phase of Operation Quiet Harvest. They prepared a controlled disruption, intervening not by arresting anyone, but by subtly altering the dead drop chain to observe how the network reacted to unexpected disturbances. The trigger would occur on January 14, 1981, during a scheduled exchange at shelf C11. On the morning of January 14, 1981, a thin layer of snow covered the parking lot of the Cedar Junction Public Library. The town was quiet in the way small Midwestern towns often were in winter. The roads half-plowed, the sidewalks coated with a brittle sheen of ice, the air filled with the distant hum of furnaces running in tightly sealed houses. Harold arrived at the library precisely at 7:56 a.m., brushing snow from his coat before unlocking the staff entrance. To any observer, he appeared as he always did, calm, punctual, predictable. But internal FBI notes recorded that during the previous week, he had begun checking over his shoulder more frequently, pausing at intersections, and leaving lights on in various rooms of his house long after bedtime. These were subtle signs, but to counterintelligence specialists, they indicated a man who sensed the walls closing in. The FBI's plan for the day was simple on paper, but delicate in execution. An agent had inserted a decoy envelope into the book, placed at C11, containing fabricated technical diagrams and a faint tracer powder invisible to the naked eye, but detectable under ultraviolet light. The purpose of the decoy was not to deceive the KGB, but to trace the chain of custody once the envelope left Harold's hands. If successful, the FBI could map the entire courier sequence to the regional handler. If unsuccessful, the network might scatter, forcing the investigation back to its initial uncertainty. Shortly after noon, Fleming entered the library as expected. Surveillance footage captured him carrying a different bag than usual, a subtle but important detail later noted in the report. He walked to the C11 shelf, scanned the spines of several books, and removed the designated volume. He opened it briefly, then placed it back. Moments later, Harold appeared, ostensibly shelving reference books. He approached the shelf, retrieved the same volume, and slipped the decoy envelope into the inner lining of his sweater vest. His expression remained carefully neutral, but he hesitated a fraction longer than usual before reshelving the book. The footage shows him glancing behind him twice, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand, and walking toward the archive room. At 4:37 p.m., Harold clocked out early, something he rarely did. Surveillance teams followed him as he drove through slushy roads, stopping at a red light longer than necessary before taking a detour through residential streets. This was a familiar pattern. He often took indirect routes when preparing to perform a drop. But today, agents noted that he circled the same block twice before continuing toward the outskirts of town. As dusk settled, Harold parked near the abandoned grain silo he had used for previous exchanges. He stepped out, clutching the brown paper bag that contained the decoy envelope. Snow crunched softly under his steps. The wind was cold enough to blur the outlines of his breath. He walked behind the bushes as before, placed the bag under a rusted metal panel, and tapped the panel lightly, a signal used by couriers to indicate completion. He returned to his car, wiped his palms on his trousers, and drove off. The FBI retrieval team waited 9 minutes before approaching the site. They removed the bag, documented the contents, replaced the decoy with an identical copy, and restored the bag to its exact position down to the millimeter. Every movement was executed with clinical precision. Operation Quiet Harvest was at its most delicate point. By midnight, ultraviolet scans confirmed the tracer powder on the decoy envelope had transferred to multiple sets of fingerprints. The first belonged to Harold. The second, detected hours later at a secondary drop site near a wooded area outside town, belonged to the unidentified man who had met Fleming in the grocery store parking lot weeks earlier. The chain was beginning to reveal itself. The tracer trail led agents to an apartment complex in Columbus, where the man delivered the envelope to another operative. Surveillance teams followed that operative to a private home in Cleveland, then to a vehicle registered to a diplomatic address in New York. The operation that had once seemed like a small-town curiosity now showed its full extent. A multi-tiered courier network spanning 3 states, feeding intelligence into Soviet channels with machine-like efficiency. While the FBI mapped the chain, Harold's world quietly deteriorated. According to neighbors, he seemed increasingly distracted, leaving his porch light on during the day, walking to the mailbox 3 or 4 times in a single afternoon, stepping outside at night as though listening for something in the dark. The library staff noticed his shelving errors multiplied. He forgot to reorder newspapers. He misplaced catalog cards he had memorized years earlier. One coworker recalled seeing him standing motionless in the stacks, staring at a row of encyclopedias with a distant, haunted look. The pressure mounted on all sides. On January 19th, Fleming abruptly stopped visiting the library. Surveillance logs recorded that he boarded a flight to Boston the next morning, then disappeared. The FBI suspected he had been recalled by Moscow after internal KGB communication flagged the possibility of compromised channels. Without his presence, the network's movements became erratic. The secondary courier missed a scheduled retrieval. A handler in Columbus abruptly abandoned his apartment. Another operative attempted to change the prearranged drop location. Such instability often preceded the collapse of an espionage network, but it also meant the FBI needed to act quickly before the entire chain vanished. On January 23rd, the FBI prepared arrest warrants for 3 individuals directly linked to the exchange chain, but they held off on issuing a warrant for Harold. Instead, they planned a controlled confrontation intended to pressure him into cooperation. The reasoning was pragmatic. Harold knew the early phases of the network that the FBI had not yet mapped. He knew names, dates, and methods that could fill the gaps in their intelligence picture. But he was also fragile, emotionally and psychologically, and the FBI feared that a poorly timed arrest might lead him to panic, flee, or worse. The confrontation was scheduled for January 27th. Agents would approach Harold at his home shortly after he returned from work. They would present limited evidence, suggest they knew more than they actually did, and offer him the chance to cooperate in exchange for leniency. It was a strategy that had been used effectively in other small-scale espionage cases. But Harold never made it to the confrontation. On the morning of January 26th, the library director noticed Harold had not arrived at work. She called his house, but there was no answer. By noon, co-workers grew concerned. A maintenance worker visited Harold's home during his lunch break and found the front door unlocked. He stepped inside, called Harold's name, received no response, and backed out quickly, sensing something was wrong. 40 minutes later, local police entered the house. Harold was sitting at his kitchen table, fully dressed, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes unfocused. A pot of coffee sat cold on the counter. Beside it lay a small notebook, the same notebook he had carried inside the library for months. He was alive, but barely responsive, his expression blank. The officers called paramedics, who transported him to the hospital. The FBI arrived 30 minutes later. In the hospital's quiet beige room, Harold spoke little. He blinked slowly, his breathing shallow, his voice nearly inaudible. The agents remained patient. Their goal was not rapid interrogation, but stabilized cooperation. Over several hours, Harold answered questions in fragmented sentences, admitting he had helped move things, and that books were safer places than people think. He acknowledged receiving instructions from Fleming, though he insisted he had never known the true consequences of his actions. Whether this was genuine naivete or a last attempt at self-preservation remained unclear. During the interview, agents found the notebook on his bedside table. Inside were handwritten lists of book titles, shelf numbers, dates, and what appeared to be coded notes. The entries revealed 2 additional dead drop points in Cedar Junction and 1 in a nearby town. This discovery expanded the known scope of the network significantly, providing the final pieces needed to complete Operation Quiet Harvest's intelligence map. By February 3rd, the FBI executed coordinated arrests across 3 states. The network collapsed in a single night. 2 couriers were detained at their homes. Another was arrested at a diner outside Cleveland. The handler in Columbus attempted to flee, but was caught before he reached the interstate. The diplomat in New York, protected by immunity, was quietly declared persona non grata and expelled within days. As for Harold, he was transferred to a federal psychiatric facility for evaluation. The medical report concluded he had undergone acute psychological decompensation triggered by prolonged stress, guilt, and fear of exposure. After several weeks, he regained enough clarity to participate in formal interrogations. He confessed to his role in the dead drop exchanges, though he maintained he had never considered himself a spy. To him, it had begun as a peculiar intellectual game, a break from the loneliness of his life, until it grew into something he could no longer control. In September 1981, Harold Benton was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign power and for the unlawful transmission of defense-related materials. The judge acknowledged his psychological vulnerability, but emphasized the severity of the damage caused by his actions. Experts later estimated that the microfilm he transferred contained sensitive industrial information worth millions of dollars to the Soviet Union's military research sector. Harold served just under 7 years. Upon release, he returned briefly to Cedar Junction, though few recognized him. He moved soon after to a small town in Indiana under a different name. He never worked in a library again. He died in 1994, alone, in a rented apartment filled mostly with paperback novels and old newspapers. Cedar Junction eventually replaced the carpet, repainted the walls, and rearranged several sections of the library shelves. Staff changed. Patrons came and went, but the quietness of the building never quite felt the same to those who remembered the events of 1980-81. For years afterward, some would notice the subtle way new librarians checked the spines of returned books, or how they paused when placing older volumes back on the shelves, as though wary of what might be hidden inside. Of Operation Quiet Harvest itself, little was publicly known until the early 2000s, when declassified documents revealed the full scope of the case. The files described it not as a story of hardened spies or sophisticated tradecraft, but as a cautionary example of how espionage networks often rely on ordinary people willing to make small compromises. One envelope, one book, one routine moment at a time. According to one internal FBI memo, the most effective covert operations are those that appear indistinguishable from daily life. In the end, the Cedar Junction Dead Drop Network did not collapse because of advanced counterintelligence techniques or high-level defectors. It collapsed because a thin envelope slipped slightly out of place inside a book on a rainy evening, exposing a fraction of its edge to someone who was never meant to see it. It collapsed because a lonely man made a small mistake after months of quiet fear. And it collapsed because in the shadows of the Cold War, even the smallest details carried extraordinary consequences. For Harold Benton, the cost of that detail was the unraveling of his life. For the FBI, it was a reminder that vigilance in ordinary places, libraries, grocery stores, bus stations, was often the key to uncovering Soviet operations. And for Cedar Junction, it became a story whispered for years. How a librarian who seemed invisible became the center of a silent conflict he never fully understood, and how a building filled with stories became the stage for one of the most discreet espionage networks of its era.